The unexpected encounter. Isaiah Clemens was a man of precision, a respected figure in the Winterdale judiciary, and someone who had built his life on the pillars of fairness and justice. As a judge, his days were packed with trials and deliberations that often left him mentally exhausted. His evening drives became his sanctuary, a brief respite where he could enjoy the soothing rhythm of jazz, reflecting on his day while cruising through the serene suburban streets. But tonight, his cherished ritual was about to take an unexpected turn. Isaiah's black luxury sedan glided through Winterdale's well-lit roads, the hum of the engine blending seamlessly with the smooth saxophone melody pouring from the car's speakers. He tapped his fingers on the steering wheel in time with the music, his mind drifting to the complexities of a particularly grueling case he had presided over earlier that day. It had been one of those moments that reminded him why he entered the legal profession, to be a beacon of fairness in a system often clouded by bias. As he turned onto Sycamore Lane, a familiar and tranquil route, a sudden burst of red and blue lights lit up his rearview mirror. The piercing sound of a police siren broke through the mellow jazz, jolting him from his thoughts. Isaiah's first reaction was confusion. He glanced at his speedometer. He wasn't speeding. His registration was current, and his car was immaculate. Why was he being stopped? Pulling over to the curb, Isaiah's heart began to pound, an involuntary reaction rooted in a lifetime of cautionary tales. His parents had drilled into him the survival strategies for such encounters: keep your hands visible, remain calm, and comply with every request. But as a judge, Isaiah had hoped he had risen above such fears. Yet, here he was, feeling the same unease that had shadowed him since his youth. The police cruiser stopped directly behind him, its flashing lights bouncing off his car's polished exterior. Through the rearview mirror, he could make out the silhouette of the approaching officer. She was tall, broad-shouldered, and moved with the deliberate gait of someone who had already made up her mind. Her uniform was pristine, and the name tag on her chest read, Officer Rhodes. "License and registration," she said curtly, her tone leaving no room for pleasantries. Isaiah's fingers trembled slightly as he reached for the glove compartment, retrieving his documents. He handed them over, maintaining a calm demeanor. "Was I speeding, officer?" he asked, his voice steady but laced with confusion. She ignored his question, taking the documents and walking back to her cruiser without another word. Isaiah's stomach knotted as he watched her retreat. The neighborhood, once a symbol of the life he had worked so hard to build, now felt hostile. Behind drawn curtains, he imagined his neighbors watching, their curiosity piqued by the sight of flashing lights outside his car. Minutes passed, each one stretching into an eternity. Isaiah's mind raced with memories of past injustices, stories of men who had done everything right but found themselves in situations that ended disastrously. He thought of his achievements, his position as a judge, and how none of it seemed to matter in this moment. To Officer Rhodes, he was just a black man in an expensive car, nothing more. When she returned, her expression was unreadable. She handed back his documents and then said the words he had been dreading, "Step out of the vehicle." Isaiah's heart skipped a beat. "Excuse me?" he asked, trying to mask his rising apprehension. "Step out of the car." "Now," she repeated, her hand resting on the butt of her gun. Taking a deep breath, Isaiah complied, opening the door and stepping into the chilly night. The streetlights cast long shadows, and the quiet hum of the suburban street was now filled with an unspoken tension. "Hands on the hood," Rhodes barked. Isaiah hesitated, disbelief washing over him. He was Judge Isaiah Clemens, a man who had dedicated his life to upholding the law, and now he was being treated like a suspect. But he knew better than to argue. Slowly, he placed his hands on the cold metal hood of his car, the humiliation stinging deeper than the night air. "Your car matches the description of a stolen vehicle reported last week," Rhodes said, circling him like a predator. Her tone was clinical, devoid of empathy. Isaiah clenched his jaw. "Officer, this is my car. I bought it recently. The registration is in my name." "Hands on the hood," she snapped, cutting him off. The weight of the moment pressed down on Isaiah. He had spent years fighting for justice, believing in the system, and now he found himself on the other side of it. He felt the eyes of his neighbors, hidden behind their curtains, watching the scene unfold. To them, he was no longer Judge Clemens. He was just another black man under suspicion. A second police cruiser pulled up, its arrival amplifying the tension. A burly officer stepped out, his expression hard and assessing. He joined Rhodes, the two exchanging words Isaiah couldn't hear. His heart sank further. Why was backup necessary? Was he now considered a threat? "We need to verify your story," the second officer said, his voice measured but firm. "Stay where you are." Isaiah nodded, swallowing his frustration. He had nothing to hide, but he also knew that the truth alone wasn't always enough. As the officers began inspecting his car, their flashlights sweeping over every detail, Isaiah stood frozen, his hands still pressed against the hood. He thought of the courtroom, where he wielded the power to determine justice, and how powerless he now felt. The burly officer stepped back after a thorough inspection and whispered something to Rhodes. Her expression hardened further. "There's a problem," she said, turning to Isaiah. "This vehicle matches the description of a stolen car." Isaiah's chest tightened. "That's impossible," he said firmly. "I have the paperwork. This car is mine." Rhodes' eyes narrowed. "We'll need to take you in for further questioning." Isaiah's mind reeled. He had done everything right, yet here he was, being stripped of his dignity and treated like a criminal. The realization cut deeper than he thought possible. In this moment, his success, his title, his integrity, none of it mattered. As the officers prepared to escalate the situation, Isaiah's resolve strengthened. This was no longer just about him, it was about challenging the prejudice that had led to this moment. He took a deep breath, determined to handle this with the grace and dignity he had always prided himself on. But he knew this was just the beginning of a long, harrowing night. A test of integrity. Isaiah Clemens stood rigidly against the hood of his car, the cool metal beneath his hands doing little to ground the whirlwind of emotions inside him. The flashing red and blue lights behind him painted the quiet suburban street in discordant hues, a stark contrast to the orderly life he had meticulously built. The silence between him and the two officers was heavy, punctuated only by the occasional static from their radios and the murmurs of curious neighbors peering from their windows. The second officer, a burly man with a stern demeanor, returned to his patrol car to presumably run the vehicle identification number. Officer Rhodes, however, remained close, her posture stiff, her hand still hovering too near her holstered gun for Isaiah's comfort. Her eyes bore into him with a mixture of suspicion and authority, a gaze he had seen far too often in his life, one that spoke of assumptions made long before any facts were considered. "Officer," Isaiah began, his voice calm but firm, "I've already explained that this is my car. The registration is valid, and the paperwork is in order. If you'd simply review it again, you'd see there's no mistake." Rhodes' lips tightened. "Sir, you need to let us do our job. The description of this vehicle matches a recent theft. Until we've cleared this up, I need you to remain where you are." Her dismissive tone sent a spike of irritation through Isaiah, but he suppressed it. He was no stranger to situations where composure was the only weapon available. As a judge, he'd learned to read people, to understand the subtleties in their behavior. And in Officer Rhodes, he recognized something beyond mere protocol, a rigidity born of prejudice. Isaiah's thoughts raced. He was a man who had spent decades navigating and challenging systemic biases. He had fought tirelessly for fairness, had seen justice triumph and falter in equal measure. But standing here, stripped of his authority and dignity, he felt the weight of an ugly truth pressing down on him. To these officers, he wasn't Judge Clemens. He wasn't a man of integrity or accomplishment. He was just another black man driving an expensive car in a neighborhood that still clung to unspoken divides. The second officer returned, his expression unreadable. He nodded to Rhodes and then glanced at Isaiah. "The VIN checks out," he said, his voice neutral, "but there's a discrepancy with the registration. The report we have indicates a vehicle with a similar VIN was reported stolen a week ago. We need to sort this out at the station." Isaiah's heart sank. "A discrepancy? Officer, I purchased this car legally. I have all the documentation to prove it. There must be an error in your records." Rhodes stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. "Sir, we're not here to argue. We're here to enforce the law. Now, either you come with us willingly, or we'll have to detain you." The threat hung in the air, heavy and oppressive. Isaiah straightened, his calm resolve giving way to a quiet but unyielding determination. "Detain me? On what grounds?" he asked, his voice rising slightly. "Because of an unverified report? Because my car looks like one that was stolen? Or is it because you can't fathom that a black man might own a vehicle like this without suspicion?" Rhodes' jaw tightened. "This isn't about race, sir." Isaiah gave a bitter chuckle. "Isn't it? Tell me, Officer Rhodes, how often do you stop cars like mine in neighborhoods like this when the driver doesn't look like me?" The second officer shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Isaiah and Rhodes. For a brief moment, it seemed like he might interject, but he remained silent. "Sir," Rhodes said, her voice hardening, "this is not the time or place for this discussion. If you have concerns about how this is being handled, you can file a complaint later. Right now, we need to proceed." Isaiah's mind raced. He knew how quickly these situations could escalate, how easily a wrong word or a perceived movement could spiral into something far worse. But he also knew that compliance wasn't the same as surrender. He had fought his entire life to prove that dignity could withstand even the most dehumanizing circumstances. Taking a deep breath, he nodded. "Fine. I'll go with you. But I'll be calling my attorney and filing a formal complaint. And I'll make sure this doesn't get buried." Rhodes' expression didn't waver, but there was a flicker of unease in her eyes. The second officer gestured toward the patrol car, and Isaiah followed, his steps measured, his back straight. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing him falter. As he settled into the back seat of the cruiser, Isaiah's thoughts turned to his colleagues, to the prosecutors and defenders who had argued before him, to the countless individuals whose lives he had impacted from his bench. Would they believe him if he told them this story? Or would they, too, find ways to justify the officer's actions, to minimize the underlying biases that had led to this moment? The ride to the station was silent, the air in the car thick with tension. Isaiah stared out the window, the familiar streets of Winterdale passing by like a distorted memory. He thought of his parents, of the lessons they had instilled in him. They had always told him that success was the best way to combat prejudice, that excellence would shield him from the worst of society's biases. But now, he saw the cracks in that belief. Success hadn't shielded him, it had only made him a more visible target. When they arrived at the station, Isaiah was escorted inside, his presence drawing curious glances from officers and staff. Some seemed to recognize him, their eyes widening in surprise, but none said a word. He was led to a small interrogation room, its sterile walls and harsh lighting a stark contrast to the grandeur of his courtroom. "Wait here," Rhodes said curtly before stepping out, leaving Isaiah alone with his thoughts. As the door clicked shut, Isaiah exhaled deeply, his mind racing with possibilities. He needed to call his attorney, to ensure that this situation didn't spiral further out of control. But more than that, he needed to confront the painful truth this night had revealed, that no matter how far he had come, the fight for justice was far from over. And now, it was personal. Isaiah leaned back in the cold metal chair, his hands resting on the table. This wasn't just a test of his patience or his dignity. It was a test of his integrity, of his belief in the very system he had dedicated his life to upholding. And he was determined to come out of it stronger. The system on trial. Isaiah sat alone in the stark interrogation room, the air around him humming with quiet tension. The cold metal chair beneath him felt unforgiving, a sharp contrast to the judge's bench he was accustomed to commanding. He drummed his fingers lightly on the table, an almost subconscious effort to maintain his composure. For a moment, he allowed himself to wonder what his colleagues would think if they saw him here, stripped of the dignity and authority that defined him. The thought was fleeting, replaced by the steely resolve that had carried him through countless trials, both in and outside the courtroom. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The door finally opened, and Officer Rhodes stepped in, her expression still guarded, clipboard in hand. A younger officer followed, his tentative demeanor suggesting he wasn't entirely comfortable with the situation. He carried a steaming cup of coffee, which he set on the table before retreating to stand awkwardly by the wall. "We've been reviewing the details of the case," Rhodes began, her tone clipped. She remained standing, a deliberate move to assert dominance. "There's still a discrepancy with the VIN. Until we can clear it up, the vehicle will remain impounded." Isaiah met her gaze, his voice calm but firm. "Officer Rhodes, I appreciate your diligence, but this so-called discrepancy is easily resolved. The dealership I purchased the car from has all the documentation. A single phone call would settle this." Rhodes' lips pressed into a thin line. "We'll handle the investigation in our own time." Isaiah's patience thinned. "And in the meantime, I'm sitting here like a criminal while you build a case out of an error. You do realize who I am, don't you?" The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, his eyes flicking between Isaiah and Rhodes. Ma'am," he ventured cautiously, "the VIN discrepancy could be a clerical mistake. Maybe we should." Rhodes cut him off with a sharp glare. "Officer Taylor, thank you, but I've got this." Isaiah noticed the brief exchange, filing it away in his mind. "Officer Taylor seems to have the good sense to suggest what you should have done the moment you pulled me over," he said, his tone pointed. "Is this about ensuring justice, or proving a point?" Rhodes' jaw tightened, but she said nothing. She tapped her clipboard once and turned to leave, motioning for Taylor to follow. "Stay here. We'll update you when we have more information." As the door shut behind them, Isaiah exhaled deeply. He pulled his phone from his pocket, grateful they hadn't confiscated it, and dialed his attorney, Michael Braxton, a sharp and unrelenting legal mind who had been his friend since law school. "Michael," Isaiah began, his voice low but steady. "I'm in a situation. I need your help." Michael's response was immediate. "Where are you?" Isaiah explained the events of the evening, keeping his tone even despite the simmering frustration. Michael listened intently, interrupting only to ask clarifying questions. "This is absurd," Michael said finally, his voice tight with anger. "I'll be there within the hour. Don't say another word to them until I arrive." Isaiah thanked him and hung up, feeling a small sense of relief. Michael's presence would shift the dynamic. But as he waited, the weight of the situation settled over him again. This wasn't just about him. It was about the countless others who had been subjected to the same treatment, many without the privilege of legal expertise or professional standing to defend themselves. The door opened once more, and this time a different figure entered. Captain Elena Morales, the precinct's commanding officer, stepped in with a sharp gaze that immediately assessed the room. Isaiah recognized her. They had crossed paths during a community outreach program aimed at fostering trust between law enforcement and the judiciary. "Judge Clemens," Morales said, her tone a mix of professionalism and regret. "I came as soon as I heard." Isaiah stood, his expression unreadable. "Captain Morales. I assume you've been briefed on the situation." She nodded. "I have. I'm here to ensure everything is handled appropriately moving forward." Isaiah raised an eyebrow. "Appropriately would have been resolving this matter at the scene, rather than bringing me here and impounding my vehicle without cause." Morales' posture stiffened slightly, but she didn't argue. "I'm reviewing the actions taken by my officers. If there were missteps, they will be addressed. For now, let's focus on resolving this matter. And how do you propose we do that? Isaiah asked, his voice carrying the weight of his frustration. Morales gestured for him to sit, then took a seat across from him. I've already contacted the dealership to verify your purchase. Once we have confirmation, this will be resolved. And what about the humiliation I've endured tonight? Isaiah pressed. The presumption of guilt, the implicit bias that led to this entire debacle? Captain Morales, this isn't just about me. This is about a culture that allows situations like this to persist. Morales met his gaze evenly. I won't deny that we have systemic issues, Judge Clemens. But I can assure you that I take them seriously. This precinct has been working to address these challenges. Clearly not enough, Isaiah said bluntly. Because tonight, I was reminded that even someone in my position isn't immune to the prejudices embedded in this system. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. Officer Taylor stepped in, holding a file. Captain, we just received confirmation from the dealership. Judge Clemens' vehicle is legitimate. The stolen car report was indeed an error. Morales took the file, scanning it quickly. She looked up at Isaiah, her expression apologetic. Judge Clemens, you're free to go. I deeply regret the inconvenience this has caused. Isaiah stood, his movements deliberate. An inconvenience is being stuck in traffic, Captain. This was an affront to my dignity and an indictment of the very system I've dedicated my life to improving. Morales inclined her head. I understand. And I hope we can address this further outside of this immediate context. Michael arrived moments later, his presence commanding. After a brief but pointed discussion with Morales, he escorted Isaiah out of the precinct. As they stepped into the cool night air, Michael turned to him. You okay? Isaiah exhaled, the tension slowly leaving his shoulders. I will be. But this isn't over, Michael. Not by a long shot. Together, they walked to Michael's car, leaving behind the flashing lights and cold walls of the precinct. Isaiah's resolve burned brighter than ever. This was no longer just about clearing his name. It was about ensuring that no one else would endure what he had that night. A reckoning begins. The following morning, Isaiah Clemens sat in his study, surrounded by the quiet hum of his life, bookshelves lined with legal tomes, a framed certificate of his judgeship, and photos of family gatherings. But this morning, the room's warmth couldn't dispel the cold anger simmering inside him. The events of the previous night replayed in his mind like a bad film, each detail sharpening his resolve. He had endured humiliation, not because of any wrongdoing but because of a system that too often acted without accountability. Isaiah's phone buzzed on his desk. It was Michael Braxton. Morning, Isaiah, Michael's voice came through, steady but edged with concern. How are you holding up? Better, Isaiah replied, though the word felt insufficient. But I've been thinking. This can't end with me walking away. This isn't just about what happened to me. It's about ensuring it doesn't happen to anyone else. Michael sighed, familiar with the tone in Isaiah's voice. You've got something in mind, don't you? Isaiah leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the framed portrait of Thurgood Marshall on the wall. I'm calling for an investigation into the precinct. I want transparency, their traffic stop data, the records of complaints against Officer Rhodes and others. And I'm reaching out to the media. If this isn't made public, nothing will change. Michael's voice was cautious but supportive. I'm with you. But you know this will ruffle feathers. You're putting a target on your back. Let them come, Isaiah said firmly. I've spent my career upholding the law. It's time the law upheld its end of the bargain. By mid-morning, Isaiah had drafted a formal request for an independent investigation into the precinct's practices, citing his experience as a case study. He sent copies to the mayor, the police oversight board, and a trusted journalist at the Winterdale Gazette, someone he knew would treat the story with the seriousness it deserved. The backlash began almost immediately. By the afternoon, Isaiah's inbox was flooded with messages. Some were supportive, colleagues, community leaders, and strangers who had read his story and applauded his courage. But others were less kind, ranging from veiled warnings to outright hostility. Social media buzzed with heated debates, his name trending as people argued over whether his actions were justified or an overreaction. Among the critics were those who questioned his motives. Why would a judge air his grievances publicly, one post read. Isn't this just another example of someone playing the race card? Isaiah refused to let the noise distract him. Instead, he doubled down, scheduling meetings with civil rights organizations and community leaders to discuss broader issues of police accountability. The more he learned, the more determined he became. His case was far from isolated, it was part of a pattern that demanded systemic change. The next significant development came during a meeting with Captain Elena Morales. She had requested a private conversation, insisting on neutrality and transparency. Judge Clemens, Morales began as they sat across from each other in a neutral municipal conference room. I want you to know that I take your concerns seriously. Last night's incident is not reflective of how I want my precinct to operate. Isaiah studied her carefully. I appreciate that, Captain. But words won't suffice. What happened to me is symptomatic of a larger issue, one that can't be ignored any longer. Morales nodded, her expression resolute. We've already begun an internal review. Officer Rhodes is temporarily relieved of duty pending the outcome. But I also know that internal reviews alone won't restore trust. Isaiah leaned forward. Then let's take this further. Release your data on traffic stops and use of force incidents. Open your doors to an independent audit. Show the community that you're not just willing to talk about change but to implement it. Morales hesitated, the weight of his words evident. That's a lot to ask, Judge Clemens. Transparency at that level will bring scrutiny, not just on my officers but on me as well. If you're doing your job fairly, you have nothing to fear, Isaiah countered. But if you're not willing to take this step, the community will see it as an admission of guilt. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken tension. Finally, Morales exhaled and nodded. I'll speak to the oversight board. But I need you to know that change like this doesn't happen overnight. No, Isaiah agreed, but it doesn't happen at all without bold first steps. Later that evening, Isaiah attended a town hall organized by a local advocacy group. The room was packed with residents, some who had experienced similar encounters with law enforcement, others who were simply curious or concerned. The air buzzed with energy, a mixture of anger, hope, and determination. When Isaiah took the stage, the applause was overwhelming. He held up a hand to quiet the crowd, his voice steady as he began. Thank you all for being here. Last night, I was reminded of something I've known for a long time but had allowed myself to forget, that the fight for justice isn't confined to the courtroom. It's out here, in our streets, our neighborhoods, and our daily lives. He paused, letting his words settle before continuing. What happened to me wasn't unique. It was part of a pattern, one that disproportionately affects people of color in this community and beyond. And while I have the privilege and platform to speak out, many do not. That's why I'm here. Not just for myself, but for every person who has been silenced, dismissed, or ignored. The crowd erupted into applause again, some standing in solidarity. Isaiah's voice grew firmer, his conviction clear. We must demand transparency. We must hold those in power accountable. And we must work together to build a system that serves and protects everyone equally, not just a select few. As he stepped down from the stage, dozens of people approached him, sharing their own stories and offering their support. For the first time since the ordeal began, Isaiah felt a glimmer of hope. This wasn't just about his experience. It was about igniting a movement. The days that followed were a whirlwind. News outlets picked up the story, bringing national attention to Winterdale. Civil rights organizations pledged their support, and the city council announced plans for a public hearing on policing practices. Isaiah knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges. But as he stood in his study that night, looking at the framed photo of his parents on the bookshelf, he felt their unspoken encouragement. They had taught him to fight for what was right, even when it was difficult. And now, he was doing just that. For Isaiah Clemens, the journey was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, he felt he was exactly where he needed to be. A community united. The town of Winterdale was no stranger to controversy, but the events surrounding Judge Isaiah Clemens had shaken its foundations. Over the following weeks, the community began to shift in ways that even Isaiah hadn't fully anticipated. What had started as a humiliating encounter during a routine drive had now become the catalyst for a larger movement. And with it, Isaiah found himself at the center of a storm, one he was determined to weather. The local police precinct had announced a public forum to address the growing concerns about racial profiling and systemic bias. Isaiah's insistence on transparency had forced their hand, and the meeting was set to be held at the town's largest civic center. Flyers, social media posts, and word of mouth ensured a turnout that exceeded anyone's expectations. People from all walks of life arrived, filling the seats and standing along the walls. The air was thick with anticipation. Isaiah arrived early, accompanied by Michael Braxton, who had been working tirelessly behind the scenes to prepare for this moment. As they entered the building, Isaiah noticed the diversity of the crowd. Young and old, black and white, professionals and working-class individuals, all had gathered with a shared purpose. It was a testament to the power of collective action. On the stage sat a panel of key figures: Captain Elena Morales, several officers from the precinct including roads, city council members, and community leaders. Isaiah took his place among them, his presence commanding but approachable. He was no longer just a judge, he was a voice for change. The meeting began with opening remarks from the city council, a formality that felt out of place given the weight of the moment. When it was Isaiah's turn to speak, he rose to his feet, the room falling silent as all eyes turned to him. "Good evening," he began, his voice steady but charged with emotion. "I stand before you not just as a judge, but as a member of this community. A community that deserves better." He paused, scanning the room, letting the gravity of his words sink in. "What happened to me is not unique. It is a symptom of a larger issue, one that has persisted for far too long. And while I was fortunate to have the resources and platform to challenge what happened, many others do not. This is about more than one incident. This is about ensuring that every person in Winterdale, and beyond, is treated with dignity and respect, regardless of the color of their skin." The crowd erupted into applause, but Isaiah raised a hand to quiet them. "This isn't just about identifying the problem. It's about fixing it. And fixing it requires all of us. Transparency from our law enforcement, accountability from our leaders, and engagement from our community. Tonight, we take the first step toward that change." Isaiah sat down, his heart pounding but his resolve unshaken. The meeting transitioned into an open forum, with residents stepping up to share their stories. A young black man recounted a harrowing encounter with police that left him shaken. An elderly white woman described witnessing discriminatory practices during her time volunteering at a local shelter. Story after story painted a picture of a system in desperate need of reform. Captain Morales took the floor next, her demeanor a mixture of professionalism and humility. "I've heard your concerns," she began, "and I won't stand here and make excuses. What I will say is that we're committed to doing better. Effective immediately, the precinct will implement bias training for all officers, expand community policing programs, and release quarterly reports on traffic stops and use of force incidents." Her words were met with a mixture of cautious applause and skeptical murmurs. Isaiah could sense the crowd's wariness. Promises were easy to make but harder to keep. He leaned forward, catching Morales' gaze, and nodded subtly. It was a silent acknowledgement that her willingness to engage was a start, but far from the finish line. As the weeks turned into months, the changes in Winterdale began to take shape. The precinct's new policies, while imperfect, signaled a shift in priorities. Officers were required to wear body cameras, and a civilian review board was established to oversee complaints. For the first time in years, the community felt like they had a say in how they were policed. Isaiah, however, was far from satisfied. He continued to meet with activists and legal experts, pushing for broader reforms at the state level. His experience had taught him that real change required persistence and vigilance. He knew that the systems he was challenging wouldn't yield easily, but he also knew that progress was possible. One evening, as he prepared for a meeting with a civil rights organization, Isaiah received an unexpected visitor. Captain Morales stood on his doorstep, her expression unreadable. "Captain," Isaiah said, stepping aside to let her in. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Morales entered, hesitating for a moment before speaking. "Judge Clemens, I've been thinking a lot about what you said at the forum. About systemic issues and accountability. I want to do more, but I can't do it alone." Isaiah raised an eyebrow. "What are you suggesting?" "I'd like to form a joint task force," she said, her voice steady. "One that includes law enforcement, community leaders, and legal experts. We need a collaborative approach if we're going to address these issues effectively." Isaiah considered her words, a mixture of surprise and respect washing over him. "That's a bold move, Captain. And one I'd be willing to support." Morales nodded, relief evident in her posture. "Then let's get to work." The task force was announced a week later, drawing praise from community members and skepticism from others. But as its work began, it became clear that this wasn't just a symbolic gesture. Policies were scrutinized, data was analyzed, and new initiatives were launched to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the community. For Isaiah, the work was exhausting but fulfilling. He saw firsthand the power of collaboration, the potential for progress when people set aside their differences and worked toward a common goal. There were setbacks, of course, moments of tension and resistance, but each small victory reaffirmed his belief that change, while slow, was possible. One night, as he sat in his study reviewing the task force's latest report, Isaiah allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. The journey had been arduous, filled with pain and uncertainty. But it had also been transformative. What had started as a personal ordeal had become a catalyst for something far greater. Isaiah glanced at the portrait of Thurgood Marshall on the wall, a quiet smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "We're not there yet," he said softly, "but we're on our way." Legacy of Justice. Months turned into a year, and the changes set in motion by Judge Isaiah Clemens' ordeal continued to ripple across Winterdale. The Joint Task Force, composed of law enforcement officers, community leaders, and legal professionals, had become a model for collaboration. Policies were being rewritten, and new training programs had been instituted to address bias and improve interactions between police and residents. The work was far from over, but the town was beginning to feel the weight of transformation. Isaiah's days were busier than ever. Between his duties as a judge, his involvement with the task force, and his speaking engagements across the state, his schedule left little room for rest. Yet, he approached each day with purpose, knowing that the work he was doing would outlast him. It wasn't just about resolving his own experience, it was about dismantling the structures that allowed it to happen in the first place. One brisk autumn morning, Isaiah found himself at the courthouse, presiding over a case that felt deeply personal. A young black man named Terrence Booker stood before him, accused of resisting arrest during a traffic stop. The circumstances were eerily similar to what Isaiah himself had faced, a routine stop that escalated unnecessarily due to perceived attitude. As the prosecutor presented their case, Isaiah's mind flickered with memories of his own nightmarish encounter. He could see the fear in Terrence's eyes, the silent plea for someone to understand that his reaction hadn't been defiance but survival. When it came time for the defense, the young man's attorney skillfully highlighted the discrepancies in the officers' testimonies, the lack of evidence supporting their claims, and the troubling patterns in their prior reports. Isaiah listened carefully, his face impassive but his heart heavy. When it came time to deliver his ruling, he spoke with clarity and conviction. "Mr. Booker," he began, "it is clear to this court that the events leading to your arrest were fraught with bias and improper conduct. The charges against you are dismissed. Furthermore, I am ordering an independent review of the officer's actions and the policies that allowed this to occur." The courtroom erupted into murmurs, a mixture of relief and astonishment. Terrence's attorney placed a steadying hand on his shoulder, whispering words of encouragement. For Isaiah, the moment was bittersweet. It was a small victory, but one that underscored how much work remained. Later that day, Isaiah returned to his chambers, only to find an envelope on his desk bearing the official seal of the governor's office. Inside was an invitation to join a statewide commission on justice reform, a role that would allow him to bring his expertise and passion to a broader stage. He read the letter twice, a mixture of pride and trepidation washing over him. The opportunity was immense, but so was the responsibility. He picked up his phone and called Michael Braxton. "Michael," he began, "I just received an invitation to join the Governor's Commission on Justice Reform." Michael's voice on the other end was jubilant. "That's incredible news, Isaiah. This is exactly the kind of platform you've been working toward." "It's a big step," Isaiah admitted. "But it's also a heavy mantle to carry. I don't want to leave the work we've started in Winterdale unfinished." "You won't be leaving it," Michael said firmly. "You'll be amplifying it. Think about it, what you've done here can serve as a blueprint for towns across the state. This isn't an ending, Isaiah. It's a beginning." Isaiah leaned back in his chair, Michael's words settling into him. He thought of the countless individuals who had supported him, the stories he had heard, and the progress that had been made. He thought of Terrence Booker and others like him, whose lives hung in the balance of a justice system that was still far from perfect. Finally, he nodded to himself. "You're right," he said. "It's time to take this fight to the next level." The commission's first meeting was held in the state capitol, a grand building that symbolized both the promise and pitfalls of governance. Isaiah walked into the chamber with his head held high, greeted by a diverse group of lawmakers, activists, legal experts, and community leaders. The room buzzed with energy, each person keenly aware of the magnitude of their task. When it was Isaiah's turn to speak, he began with a story. He recounted his experience with Officer Rhodes, the humiliation of that night, and the steps he had taken to turn his pain into progress. He spoke of the task force in Winterdale, the reforms they had achieved, and the challenges they had faced. "What happened to me was not an anomaly," he said, his voice steady but impassioned. "It was a reflection of systemic issues that demand systemic solutions. We cannot afford to be complacent. The stakes are too high, and the cost of inaction is measured in lives." The room was silent as his words hung in the air. Then, one by one, heads began to nod, and a ripple of applause spread through the chamber. Isaiah felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was where he needed to be, fighting for a future where justice was not a privilege but a guarantee. Back in Winterdale, the changes continued. Officer Rhodes had been dismissed following the findings of the independent review, and the precinct's new leadership had embraced the reforms Isaiah had championed. The Civilian Review Board had gained respect and legitimacy, becoming a trusted intermediary between the police and the community. One evening, as Isaiah walked through his neighborhood, he saw something that gave him hope. A group of children, black, white, and everything in between, played together in the park, their laughter carrying on the breeze. Parents watched from benches, chatting amicably. It was a small scene, but it represented something larger, the potential for a community to heal and grow when given the chance. As he stood there, a young boy approached him, holding out a piece of paper. "Are you Judge Clemens?" the boy asked, his eyes wide with curiosity. Isaiah smiled and nodded. I am. What's this? The boy handed him the paper, which turned out to be a school assignment. We're learning about people who make a difference, the boy said. Can I write about you? Isaiah's throat tightened, and he crouched down to meet the boy's gaze. You can write about anyone you want, he said gently. But if you write about me, make sure you tell the whole story. Not just what I did, but what we did together as a community. The boy nodded solemnly before running back to join his friends. Isaiah watched him go, a quiet smile on his face. The road ahead was still long, but moments like this reminded him why the journey was worth it. For Isaiah Clemens, justice was no longer just a concept. It was a legacy, one he was determined to leave better than he had found it.